Hello friends, and welcome to another figure study where I'm surprisingly legitimately excited to talk about this. And the this that I'm gesturing at is the Magic Classroom Space Morphers set. I don't really know what the story is with this other than I believe it was a set of transforming figures that were designed to go along with with China's Aerospace Museum, I think. And it was designed by a company called Magic Classroom. I've seen these on AliExpress and eBay. I got mine from Sir Toys, but there are other places you can look. But yeah, this is a really interesting set that I actually like a lot, despite the fact that it's sort of, I don't want to say knockoff-y, but it kind of sits in that realm between knockoff and official. Some of what's going on here is not exactly up to par, but then other stuff that's going on is surprisingly well thought out and well structured and kind of really cool. So let's just get into it. I don't know the names of any of these. I don't know if they even have them. They probably do, but I don't know. So I'm just going to refer to them as rocket, shuttle, satellite, radar dish, I think, and rover. I could be wrong. That may not be what they even are. I think the shuttle's kind of a given. Point is, I can't be bothered to do a bunch of research to try and figure out what these things are called, so that's just what I'm going to call them. Keep bumping this tail. Now, to start things off, let's just go down the line from, I guess, my least favorite to my most favorite. So, starting with the satellite. It looks like a satellite. It's got the solar panels on the sides. They're blue, but it's got solar panels. As a satellite, I think it works really well. It gets that image across. The only real gripe I have is a similar gripe that I'll have with a lot of the stuff through this set is primarily it could just use more paint. I completely understand that this is kind of a bizarre set in its intention and execution and all that, so like I'm not saying they needed to, I'm just saying this stuff would probably look a little better if it did have more paint. But that being said, the solar panels on the satellite, I feel like they'd probably look better if they used like some kind of copper color or something like that. And the thing is, they actually did use copper on the rover. So they did have that color when they were making these figures. But then again, the rover has no white and no blue on it. So that kind of sets it apart from a lot of the other stuff in this set too. So I don't know. But yes, white and blue and silver are kind of the main colors of the whole thing, with some exceptions. Oh, and black. There are black accents on everything. Satellite looks the part, could just use a little bit more paint, but the detailing's nice, the shape gets the point across. Like you can tell what it is just by looking at it. Next up, the dish, radar dish, communications dish. It might be a communications dish, or even maybe a radio telescope. I don't freaking know, but the big dish. Now, one other thing I'll say that I actually really respect about this set in general is, aside from a few very specific spots, you don't really see any robot junk on the alternate modes, which I think is really cool. Anyway, the dish. It looks the part. It's a very dishy dish in kind of a silvery, like a dull silver. I don't hate the colors on these things, but like the blue and white is just kind of, I don't know, the blue just is a little bit meh to me, but it works. Having the blue for the little bit sticking out, I don't know what that's called, the antenna on the inside of the dish, looks a little bit weird, but the shape is all there, the molding's there. This one is, though, as you probably already noticed, the one where you can clearly see some very visible robot hands. There may have been a better way to tuck those away, I don't know. It's fine. You don't really notice it from the front, at least, because there's this big dish in the way. And then also there's this weird thing that attaches to the back, which it's where you store the weapon for this guy. Incidentally, there are weapons for all the other vehicles, but there's no real good place to store them, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Moving on from the dish, there is the rover. I actually think the rover, for what it is pretty neat. I like how they've got the kind of segmented wheels on these little struts that kind of look like you'd expect for one of these automated rovers. It has the fold-out solar panels, which unfortunately they put the coppery color on the outside, but not on the inside where the actual panels are. And this fold-up radar dish, not radar dish, but this fold-up antenna thing. And I think that's really cool. And I also think it's cool how, if you want, you can collapse all that in, close it up, and turn it into basically a box on 6 wheels. The Rover does have some nice detailing and some nice paint. It could, of course, use more, like they all could, but what's here works well. One thing that annoys me, though, is this weird little exhaust pipe looking thing on the back. I don't know what that's for. It serves zero purpose. There's no mode that this thing turns into that uses that port thing, and it's not used to store the weapons. I checked. None of the weapons accessories store using that port, so like, why is it there? Anyway, moving on. The colors on the Rover are nice, but it does stand out because it's primarily like this grayish, trying to look silver color. But I do think the Rover's neat. It's my third favorite out of the entire group, but it is actually pretty neat. Now the Shuttle. The Shuttle is actually very effective. It's got this weird little air scoop looking thing at the top, which stands out a bit, but other than that, and the fact that the tail is this silvery color, which is actually made out of die-cast. I didn't mention that. There is some die-cast on most of these figures, but the tip of the tail and that little air scoop thing are both silvery and die-cast, and it doesn't quite look right on a Shuttle, but I think overall it's still a relatively clean Shuttle, though you do have the very visible ball joints in the nose tip. There's that big hole on the left side of the front of the Shuttle. And you may notice also there are pegs on the sides of the Shuttle. One of those pegs snapped off. That snapped off in transit, and I was gonna fix it, and then I thought about it and it's kind of like, you know, I don't care because it's a relatively flat surface without the peg, and that peg is only used for pegging on the weapon accessories. And trying to peg on the weapon accessories in vehicle mode does not work on the Shuttle. If you peg it on, it has to be pointing straight up, so it makes it completely pointless. So there's no reason to hang on to that peg. And in robot mode, spoiler I guess that these guys have robot modes, you can peg the weapons on, but the thing is, the Shuttle uses the same kind of accessory as the Rover, and because the Rover is robot mode, I feel like it looks so much better if you give the Rover both of the weapon accessories, which we'll see when we get to the robot mode. But yeah, aside from the peg issue, which again I decided I'll just leave it off, I do actually really like the Shuttle. The windows have been painted, but they kind of painted over the windows and the trim around them. Maybe if I'm feeling it one day, I might go in and try and paint the individual windows a little bit more separately, but overall, Shuttle, very cool. And then the rocket. The alt mode for the rocket is not my favorite alt mode. I think that would actually go to the Shuttle. But I freaking love the rocket's transformation in robot mode, which we'll see, obviously. But the rocket is, again, pretty simplistic, but gets the point across, has some very simple red checkerboard tampography painting along the side, and the text up along the nose, which I don't know what that says. But yeah, it's got the appropriate look. You've got the smaller 4-stage rockets around the side. It's got the boosters on the underside. It looks the part. It's a stick, basically. And the alt modes are also pretty decent sizes. Obviously, the heights are going to be different because they're all in very different configurations and how they transform and how they kind of curl up into their modes. So some are going to be shorter, some are going to be much wider, like the Shuttle, because it's got, it lays down, doesn't stand straight up like the rocket. But I want to say these are probably somewhere in the vague vicinity of like Voyager, Leader, kind of fluctuating back and forth between those two classes, or price points, whatever you want to call it, in terms of size. And obviously, they don't scale with each other at all, which is fine. It doesn't bother me in the slightest, because I just do not care about scale. But for those who are curious, yeah, that's how big they are with everything else. Now, for those transformations, I gotta say, even my least favorites out of all of this have really interesting transformation stuff going on here, and the robot modes you end up with are incredibly unique for almost all of them. I feel like the Shuttle is maybe the least unique of them all, but even the Shuttle's really interesting. Despite being my least favorite, the Satellite does some interesting stuff. A lot of the figures in this set do involve pulling and yanking stuff on tracks, but they do all click into place, which is good. But even then, the Satellite does do some interesting stuff. I think it's kind of cool how the booster section or engine section opens up and turns to the side and clicks along that little double hinge to turn that shape sideways and become feet. And as a byproduct of the transformation, it gives the feet ankle tilts. I also think it's really interesting how, despite the obvious shortcomings of the design, the arms just kind of unfurl from what was the top of the Satellite. Yeah, you've got biceps that kind of sit weird and angle back, but it's still a really interesting take on an arm transformation. In addition to that, there's this really interesting element they added where you've got these black panels on the forearms that you can actually click out. At first I didn't know what those were for, and then I realized when you click them out, it kind of makes that forearm bulk out a little bit, and it makes that shape line up with the actual bicep placement more, so it doesn't look as much like the forearm is jutting off to the side, and kind of makes it look more like it's one smooth arm. It just kind of cleans up the silhouette. I think that's really interesting. Well, I definitely have my issues with the transformation of the dish and also the robot mode that it turns into. There's some interesting stuff going on here. I mean, yeah, you still got the legs that slide out like you did with the satellite, and it actually unfolds to flatten against the side of the alt mode, and then you curl it back in to bulk out those arms, and then you swing the arms around. And I also think it's really cool how the dish itself splits apart, the dish flipping around to the back to essentially act as wings almost. And then you flip out the head, and that center mass of the dish that's left over flips around and tucks in and makes a surprisingly convincing looking chest plate. And that portion, that center portion of the dish, is also die-cast metal, so that is pretty solid. I didn't mention before, but the front shin plates on the satellite are die-cast as well. The Rover is also really interesting. Some of the steps for the Rover are kind of what you'd expect, with the legs doing like a Combiner Wars style, open up the panel, telescope things out kind of deal. But it is interesting to me how you actually rotate the legs themselves 180 degrees at the thigh to move all of the connection bits for the vehicle mode or rover mode to the outside. I always like that transformation step for some reason, when part of it is to like rotate the legs around rather than the waist. I don't know, it's just an interesting change compared to what we're used to. The arms are also kind of interesting in how those wheels flip around and fold up to the backs of the forearms. They do get in the way for articulation, and I definitely have some articulation issues with the Rover, which I'll get into later, but I still think that's an interesting step. And I also think it's kind of cool how the solar panel section ends up flipping back and rotating around to make a fairly clean little backpack. And then you flip up the head and pull out a little horn, which is kind of an interesting touch. And you can even click the arms into the torso to kind of settle that butterfly motion in a little bit. And also, of course, gotta mention the way that the midsection kind of accordions together around the stomach, where you connect the upper torso to the lower torso. And what's really interesting about that is not only do you have two halves of the torso connecting together for the transformation, but it still allows for a waist swivel, which again we'll see in the articulation portion, but it's just really interesting and surprisingly clever. Now I get to talk about the shuttle. The shuttle's really cool. So things start off kind of similar to the Rover, where you open a panel, accordion out the legs, kind of like a Combiner Wars figure, and folding out the arms. Not that big a surprise, but it is kind of cool how the arms themselves make up a decent chunk of the top of the shuttle. Though I also have to say, I really like how that one section of the side of the shuttle folds in, both to clean up the forearm and also actually cover up the hollowness in the back. And then we gotta talk about that torso transformation. It's like an even cooler version of what happens with the Rover. I really, really like how you move that metal piece, which exposes new detail, tuck it up further into the body, and then accordion together the entire lower and upper body along this kind of double hinge slider mechanism. And so that metal piece becomes the midriff, and the piece that the metal bit was covering becomes the belt section, I guess, if you want to call it that. I just really like how that torso comes together. It completely shifts the mass, for lack of a better term, of the bulk of the shuttle, and it's really cool. And you even get this fun little tail fin open and flip out, kind of like Astrotrain, yet this guy looks nothing like Astrotrain. Yeah, you get the wings hanging off the back, along with the engine stuff, but I think that's alright. Rocket, though, is by far my favorite transformation out of the set. It starts off with the fairly typical pull two bits apart along a slider and they snap together in place, and that extends the midsection. Then you can split the back section open and fold out some panels to do kind of a sideways Combiner Wars style leg extension. All that fairly typical. I do think it's really cool though how the parts of the fins on the shuttle unfold and you actually end up with the feet that were hidden underneath, or at least the toes were hidden underneath those panels. You rotate those to the side and give them proper feet. And then we get to everything else that is so cool. I love the arm transformation and how you extend the tip of the rocket up, split it apart, rotate those sections around independently and put them back down. And then the way those arms transform. I love how the tip of the rocket pushes in and shifts down to both reveal a fist, but also, if you look at it, it changes where the position of the fist is. Initially, when I looked at this thing in videos, I thought, that seems like an unnecessary step. But then I realized that fist is filling in the hole that you now have that almost works as sort of like a gauntlet arm guard, hand guard thing. So it shortens the forearm, but ends up giving you this kind of really nifty looking forearm armor. And then there's the way that the arm itself accordions in at the bicep. I've seen some people have some issues with this, but there is actually a peg in there that if you angle it right, you can get the peg in and it'll kind of snap, like not worryingly snap, just kind of click to go into place, and that keeps that bicep nice and solid, and so it shortens the arm as well. So it really does a fantastic job of changing the proportions of that elongated front section of the rocket down into more compact looking robot arms. And then there's the head reveal, which is kind of cool, where you fold down the tip of one of the booster sections and you just kind of slide everything up. And that tip is die cast. But I like how you flip it around, you get to see some new kind of mechanical detail that's revealed. And as you slide that up along with that whole section, it reveals the head. It'll peg into place in the torso, and it pegs into place okay. I kind of wish it sat back a little bit more flush to the body, but it does peg in when you need it to. And if you give the back of the head a little bit of a tug, you'll feel a soft click, and that settles the head in place so you don't have to worry about things sliding back down. And what we're left with is a really interesting assortment of really kind of all over the place robot designs. They kind of work as a team and they kind of don't, because again, the Rover just kind of stands out because it's the only one that's entirely gray. But you do have a bit of gray and silver in most, if not all, of the other robot modes. Though you don't really get any white, blue, or red in the Rovers. That does kind of make him stand out. But I don't know, I feel like that works. I feel like he could be the one standout of the team or something. Like he's the brawler or something, and that's why he looks a little bit different. I don't know. I don't know the backstory to these things, so I'm just inventing headcanon as I go. But yes, this is a really interesting set of bots. Now, I do have my issues with some of them. Like, for example, the satellite. The satellite's grown on me a bit. One thing I will say, despite how bizarre the proportions are, in particular that kind of cinched in waist, I think he might actually be the most dynamic out of all of them. Because of the way he transforms, you've got that panel underneath the head that can allow for some extra downward motion on the head. I think he's pretty much got almost everything you want in terms of articulation. It's just kind of placed weird. Like, he has ankle tilts. He has 90-degree knees. He has thigh swivels. He has forward and backward motion and outward motion on the hips. He has a waist swivel. He actually has a waist rocker, technically, because of the way the slider comes down. It doesn't really lock into place. He has forward, backward, in and out rotation of the shoulders. He has a bicep swivel, though the bicep swivel is a little bit hampered by the forearm kibble if you've got the forearms adjusted a certain way. But he also has elbow bend, technically, which does look a little weird. And then, of course, he has the head plate and the ball-jointed neck for the head. So it can get pretty expressive. And I will say, for as not as thrilled at the robot mode as I am with the satellite, I think that head sculpt is actually pretty cool. There's just something about that black, silver, and blue color combination, especially with like the big silver mouth plate. It just pops. And the shapes and angles on it are really nice. I like that kind of almost a three-sided mouth plate that they've got going. The edges are a little rounded, but it's kind of got that shape. Now, the dish is the one that made out probably the worst in terms of robot mode functionality, let's say. It looks fine. I like the bulk. I think the torso looks really cool. The proportions aren't terrible. And I said before, I really like that chest transformation. I think it's kind of cool how you have the silver inverted radar dish chunk, or whatever dish chunk, for a chest plate, and then those other pieces end up on the back and almost look like wings. That's really cool. Color breakup is pretty nice too. I don't even mind the thing sitting behind his head, like that's fine, whatever. But the unfortunate thing with the dish is he's the most hampered in terms of articulation. The head doesn't turn at all. He does have forward-backward rotation on the shoulders and a tiny bit of outward motion, but it's a ball joint stuck inside the torso mass, so you're not going to get a lot of outward motion, and that really stinks. You do get bicep swivels though, which is good, and elbows. The elbows are really big, chunky gear mechanisms, but you get elbows. And you also get wrist swivels, which is cool. You do get a waist swivel, though it doesn't go very far. And you get forward, backward, in and out of the hips, but unfortunately the hip inward and outward motion on mine is very loose. I tried tightening it, and it made it slightly better, but it's still kind of floppy, which is a little annoying. You got really tight thigh swivels for some reason, and then you got the knee rotation, and then the problem that I have too with this guy is the fact that the legs tend to want to angle in, and that's not really an ankle tilt, it's just like just below the knee they have this tendency to want to angle in, and that's kind of annoying, and I kind of want to tighten that joint up a little bit, but I'm afraid if I do it'll make the slider really difficult to use, so I haven't quite decided what to do there. And you get a little bit of toe angling, so you can tilt the toe left and right to just kind of make it look more like he's standing flush against the ground. Now the Rover. The Rover, again, you can see there's some copper on the chest there, which is kind of like, okay, why didn't they use that for the solar panels on the satellite, or the inside of the solar panels on the Rover itself, you know? It would have been nice, but whatever. I don't mind the wheels sticking off the forearms, but they do get in the way when it comes to straightening out the elbows, so that's a little bit of a shame. Also, because of this guy's center of gravity, you kind of have to be extremely particular about how you clip the midsection together, because if things are shifted too far in one direction or another, he's going to have trouble standing up. And you might need to lean him forward a bit, and that's a little bit... I'm not crazy about that. The head looks pretty decent though. I, again, like the matte black with that silver, almost wheeljack-esque mouth plate, and the blue visor, though for some reason the visor on the Rover is a much darker blue than the blue that we see on the other robots. I don't know why that is. The flip-out horn is kind of cute too. Now in terms of articulation, the head is on a ball joint, but it is very restricted because of both the way the ball joint is set up and because of the way it's kind of tucked inside that collar section. You get forward, backward, in and out motion on the arms, though in and out is a little bit limited if you have the arms clicked in all the way, but I still recommend doing that because if you unclick them, then that forward and backward butterfly that you use for the transformation is super loose. And you can utilize that forward and backward butterfly a little bit if you're careful. Unfortunately, no bicep swivels. That really bums me out, particularly because of the wheel kibble on the forearms. I really think having bicep swivels on this guy would have been a huge help in working around the restrictions that that kibble creates. And as I mentioned before, despite the way that torso comes together, you do get a waist swivel. That is really cool. You also get forward, backward, in and out of the hips, thigh rotation, and knees, though the knees kind of suck. They do have detents, but the detents are kind of soft, and the space between is kind of floppy. I ended up having to tighten those knees a bit, and even then, still not great. And they don't bend up to 90. Despite the fact that they have space for it, they just do not bend far enough. And that's just a shame. But you do get up and down motion on the toes as well as toe tilts, so that's something. Also, while we're talking about the feet, another big downside to the Rover is the fact that the way that he's designed doesn't really have the best heels. He can stand, but I really, really wish they had done something to either increase the size of the foot base a little bit more or give him flip-out heels. That would have been nice. And now the Shuttle. The Shuttle is very cool. I imagine some people might have issues with the Astro Train bow tie ripoff thing, but I don't. I think it's neat. I also like how much more color you get in the robot mode versus the Shuttle. Because the Shuttle is pretty much just black and white with a little bit of red on the wings and some silver for the tip of the tail and that, you know, air scoop thing. But in the robot mode, you get these added blue details in the midsection, you get the nice blue and red details that are painted in on the inside of that split open tail fin, and it just adds a little bit more to it, you know? I also kind of like how the shoulders come up a little bit further maybe than is almost necessary, but in a cool dynamic way. And it kind of makes the shoulder line almost follow the V shape of that split tail fin bow tie thing. Now the head's not bad. I don't even mind that they painted the mouth plate on this one a little bit differently, where you just got that little almost Gundam-esque divot around the chin, and then the rest of the plate is left black, and then they painted the eyes blue. I think that's fine. Unfortunately, I got a little bit of silver paint slop just above the left eye. I tried to take it off using the rubbing alcohol trick that works for some Transformers figures. No luck. Whatever paint they used on these things, it's on there. So that's a little bit of a shame, but it's fine. I don't have any prior character knowledge or animation models or anything really to compare any of these guys to, so he just has a silver spot above his left eye. It's fine. Now for articulation, the head does turn left and right, and it can look down using the transformation platform. Oh, also I should mention, I had to modify the inside of the head cavity a little bit because things were just a little too cramped in there, and the head was getting, not stuck, but like I would have to get a spudger to really pry it out, and it didn't really need to be like that. So I ended up taking an X-Acto knife and just kind of carving away a little bit of the plastic around the rim. And now that I've shaved that down, I can get the head out no problem, and it doesn't flop out or anything like that. Anyway, you get the forward, backward, in and out motion on the shoulders. You get bicep swivels, you get elbows. The wrists don't move, but you can kind of angle them up and down if you wanted to because of the transformation. Unfortunately, no waist swivel. I guess maybe it just sits a little bit too close to that mechanism where the torso bits come together. I don't know. You get forward, backward, in and out motion on the hips, thigh rotation, knees, and ball jointed ankles. So this guy's pretty posable. And then there is my favorite, the rocket. I adore this robot design. I love the transformation, and that design is so cool to me. There's just so many elements that I love about this thing. I love how you've got these three kind of rocket booster tips around the upper body, but then there's the one inverted one in the midsection. It just kind of creates an interesting visual imbalance, but like a purposeful imbalance almost. I love the way the arms come together, and I love those bulky forearms that almost look like they've got giant bucklers like built into them. Those are really super cool. The legs are not what I'd call super impressive looking or anything like that, but I just think they come together really nicely. And it's just really cool. I feel like you could look at this thing and not necessarily know that it came from a rocket. It looks like it transforms into something, but the slender, elongated shape of a rocket just doesn't quite seem like it fits this thing. The head sculpt is very cool as well. Again, like the shuttle, they kind of left the faceplate black, but painted that little strip in the center. Though I like how the rocket's head is a little bit more like... The shuttle's has more curves to it, and the rocket's is kind of a similar general idea, but like instead of having the curves, it's kind of added angles to those curves. I'm probably doing a bad job of explaining it, but I just think it's a cool head. As with the shuttle, you get rotation, you do not get up and down motion. The shoulders go forward, backward, in and out, and because of the way the transformation works, you can rotate the tips of those booster sections to give forward and backward butterfly motion, which is really cool. Despite how this all comes together, you also still get bicep swivels. They're right above the elbow, but I think that's perfectly fine. And if you don't want to use that joint, you can use that upper rotation butterfly motion to kind of act as a bicep swivel if you wanted to. And then you do get elbows too, ratcheted elbows. I am disappointed that you don't get a waist swivel on the rocket though. I feel like feel like nothing. They could have fit a waist swivel in there. The way it all comes together, the fact that they used a waist swivel on the satellite that also uses a pull rail locking system like the rocket does in that section, like they could have fit a waist swivel in there. And that's just a shame, because that waist swivel would have gone a long way to make it even more cool and expressive. And the hips can go forward, backward, in and out, like you expect. You get the knee bend, and it can actually bend forward too a little bit. Now, the knees on the rocket were incredibly, the ratchets on it were like kind of nerve-wrackingly tight at first, but after flexing it back and forth a little bit, it kind of worked the joint in a little bit, and now it still holds in place, it's just not as scarily stiff. And then you can rotate the toes if you want, but he doesn't actually stand on the toes. So rotating those toes is purely for aesthetics. They're not even going to touch the ground. Now, before I wrap things up, I also want to say I did do some modification on a couple of these guys. Specifically the satellite and the rocket. I had to modify the hips. Well, I didn't have to, but I did, because I really like the rocket. The rocket is so freaking cool. and I wanted him to be as cool as I could possibly get him. And unfortunately, his hips were ratcheted and did that thing that we all hate, where it goes from either stock straight or in the process of doing jumping jacks. The reason I modified the hips on the satellite is because I don't care that much about the satellite, so I used the satellite as my guinea pig. And so I scraped off some of the plastic around the ratcheted detents for the ratchets in the hips for the satellite to kind of test out the theory, and it worked. It removed the ratcheting at the base, so it still ratchets the further out you go, but it gives you a much more natural stance because it doesn't go from stock straight to way out anymore. So I did that to the rocket as well, and so now they have a much more natural looking stance, and I think that's really nice because, again, I think these toys, especially the rocket, are really cool, and I just really wanted them to be able to look cool just standing there. You can see the shuttle has ratcheted in and out motion, and those ratchets are fine. So I don't know why they didn't use those ratchets for the other two that have ratchets in the hips, but whatever. Now, another thing that might be a little surprising is these guys are kind of big. They're not Tobot big, but they are pretty much leader height, like modern leader height. Well, I guess it depends on the leader, because Grimlock is still huge, but you know what I mean. They're roughly leader height, or possibly Voyager height, in particular tall Voyagers. So these guys are not small. They look really cool together. We still need to talk about the accessories. I completely forgot about the accessories. So, you've got 4 weapon accessories, 5 if you count the one that the dish has. 2 smaller guns, 2 bigger guns. The bigger guns are for Rover and or the shuttle. The 2 smaller guns are for the satellite and or the rocket. And you just peg them onto their forearms, essentially. Well, essentially nothing. That is where they go. One for all of them if you really wanted to. I personally don't. I think the Rover looks much cooler if you put both of the guns on Rover's forearms. Because, you know, he's the big hulking brutish guy, so give him the 2 big guns on his forearms. I just think that looks cooler. And the satellite can peg the gun onto the forearm, which is fine, but the thing is, it's already got a built-in gun that swivels out on the left arm. So that just seems kind of unnecessary. So what I end up doing is I just end up pegging both of the smaller guns to the rocket's forearms. And that gets everything out of play. And yeah, this is a very cool set. And now is when I would say it's time to wrap it up. But actually, this set does a little bit more. Yes, despite having the weirdness of all the different space vehicles and non-vehicles that turn into robots that range from kind of silly looking to extremely cool looking, they also combine. And the combination on this is kind of interesting because there's nothing new happening until we get to the torso, or the dish. For the most part, you take everyone from their robot mode to their respective limb modes. This explains the crater in the side of the shuttle, because it just pegs into the side there. The small weapons have been hands the whole time. I suppose it was kind of obvious, but at the same time, maybe you didn't notice, I don't know. But yes, those uncurl to become hands, and either weapon can work as either hand. I will say, the thumbs on one of mine were swapped around. It's just they pegged the thumbs on the wrong sides of the same hand. So I just had to pop the thumbs off. They're just on little, like, clipped mushroom-style pegs. So just pop the thumbs off, moved them to their opposing sides, popped them back on, and now everything's fine. But yeah, those turn into hands. The big guns, the guns fold up and become toes, which is interesting. They don't actually become feet, they just become toes, and you peg those into the side of the rover or the tail fin, open tail fin of the shuttle, respectively. And it ends up making surprisingly cohesive-looking limbs. And of course, when you get to the torso, you've got that big chunk on the back that swings around to become the new pelvis for the combined mode. And the legs flip up to bulk out the chest. The combined mode face flips out from the torso to meet up with that chunk that was sitting behind the dish robot's head the whole time to give it like this big, massive combiner head. The satellite just kind of spins around at the waist and you peg the hand in. But the rocket's interesting because something I didn't realize at first with the rocket is you actually have to flip those connectors that the arms are connected to that you pulled up to pull the arms out and rotate them around. You have to flip those around entirely, 180 degrees. The reason you do that is because you can connect the rocket to the combiner peg in either configuration, but there are teeth on the inside of the connection when it's facing the 180 degrees, like flipped down. So if you want to actually make use of the ratchet joint on the shoulder, you need to flip it around. Not a huge fan of having to pop the top section of the rocket off and then peg it onto the back, but given how this thing transforms, I'm not entirely sure what else you can really do with it. And now may I present whatever the heck this thing is called. This combine mode is ridiculous and kind of a mess. And truth be told, I wasn't really feeling it at all when I first got this set in. I got the set for the robot modes. I have no interest in the combine mode at all. But the more I've messed with it, the more I've transformed things back and forth, I've actually really started to like this combine mode, and I know it definitely is swimming with flaws, but it's still interesting. It does some interesting stuff. The transformation on this thing, as basic as the overall combiner ends up being, is still really interesting and cool. They put some serious thought into the engineering on this thing. Now, this thing, as I said, is kind of a mess. The proportions are a little bit weird. Like, no matter what I do, I've yet to be able to really reliably get the arms to matching lengths. Even when they are at matching lengths, you'll notice the elbows are at two completely different spots. And this is how you're supposed to transform it. If you wanted to, you could rotate the lower body of the satellite around 180 degrees, extend the legs fully, and get the use of a double elbow there, but then the satellite arm is way longer than the rocket arm. So it's a trade-off. Though I do think it's kind of neat how the shoulder line is about the same for both of them. Like, these spires stick up a little bit, but overall, it still doesn't have a terrible silhouette, all things considered. The colors are a bit all over the place. Like, you've primarily got the white and black. You get a little bit of blue in the torso and in the left arm. You don't really get any in the right arm. And then you've got all this gray and silver for the right leg. And you get a little bit of that with the left arm, which I think really helps. I think as asymmetrical as it is, it does kind of help to not so much balance out the weird having one silver, gray, whatever leg, but it kind of complements it, I guess. So I think it actually does kind of work. It would have been nice if the faceplate, visor, whatever on the combiner head was not a grayish silver color, like maybe make it something that really stands out, something that pops among all of this, but it is what it is. I could always paint it myself if I really wanted to. But yeah, overall, it's a cool looking combiner. It's kind of goofy and kind of a mess, but I also really, really like it. I think the head's also really cool too. As I said, the faceplate, visor, whatever, I think it'd be nice if it was a different color. The helmet being blue, there isn't too much visible blue in the combine mode, so it doesn't bother me too much, but that may have looked better if it was a different color. But the design of it is really interesting. It looks like a space helmet. I don't know for sure if that's what they were going for, but it definitely looks like a space helmet, and given the theme going on here, I think that's incredibly appropriate. So it fits, and it's a neat looking head. Unfortunately, it doesn't turn. I mean, the way it transforms, I understand why the head doesn't turn. It would be cool if it did, but it doesn't, and I do understand why. You do get possibility of in and out motion on the shoulders, but it's just friction, and it's really just in service of rotating the combiner pegs down, so you're not going to get much use out of that in and out motion. It's just going to flop back down, especially because the arms are kind of heavy. You do get ratcheted forward and backward motion on the shoulders. Now, the articulation on the arms differs slightly. Because of the waist swivel on the satellite, you get a bicep rotation, but the rocket doesn't have a waist swivel, so you don't get any rotation on that arm. That being said, you do get double jointed elbow effect with the rocket because those knees can bend forward, or if you wanted to, you could rotate it around the other way and use the full knees going the other direction. Now, because of the fact that the hands peg in, you can rotate at the wrist, you can twiddle the thumb back and forth a little bit, and you can bend the fingers in and out a bit. For the satellite, you only get a single elbow. You can fully extend the robot mode legs to gain access to those knees, but the knees don't bend forward, so you're going to have to rotate everything around 180 degrees, and then you get those visible screw holes, but that does give you a double jointed elbow option. But as I said before, it makes the arm for the satellite way longer than the one for the rocket. So it looks a little bit weird. But you do get the same hand articulation on the satellite as well. Though because of the way that the engines, boosters, whatever, are arranged on the satellite, it can get in the way a little bit when you're trying to rotate that wrist. Like the thumb can catch a little bit if it's extended. There's no waist movement. Given how this thing transforms, I'm not surprised. You do get forward and backward motion on the hips, and that's it. You do not get any in and out motion. That is a little disappointing. I would have liked to be able to give this guy just a slightly more dynamic standing pose, just to have those hips go out just a little bit. But nope, you only get the rotation. And you don't really get thigh swivels either. You can rotate the rover at the robot mode waist, which can angle the foot a little bit, in and out, whatever, but you don't get a waist rotation on the shuttle, so you don't get a similar function for the other legs. So you can only slightly rotate one leg, which is just kind of a shame. And then, because of the way that the rover attaches, you can bend the knee kind of in and out below the knee on the rover, but you've got the proper robot mode legs and hips and knees facing forward on the shuttle side, so that actually does give you knee functionality. So it's a very mixed bag of articulation. You can kind of fudge some poses a little bit with this guy, but really your best bet is to just get him standing there looking cool. Or cool for this, anyway. Now, in terms of size, I was not prepared for how big this combined mode was. Like I said, I did not get this for the combined mode, but when I put them all together, I was not prepared. This thing is not absurd third-party Gestalt big, but it's pretty big. It's taller than Wei Zhang's Warrior Calculation King. I was actually kind of expecting it to be around the same size, but no, it's definitely taller. It's almost as tall as Fans Hobby's Double Evil, their Overlord. That was a freaking shock. It stands way above your average Tobot and Helicarbot. It's almost as tall as some Korean combiners that I own. I mean, not as tall as others, but it's almost as tall. And because it's so tall, it's been a little bit of a challenge figuring out where to put it on the shelf. Or at least where to put it on the shelf if I want to be able to see whatever's behind it. Like I said, I got them for the individual robot modes, so I can just display them that way. Though they take up more shelf space that way because, you know, it's 5 bots instead of 1 bot. It just takes up a wider space, so yay, reality and physics. But I think that is going to do it. I've been going on for way too long. My throat is very much in need of not being used for a little bit. I need to drink more water. So I'm going to call it here. That has been my look at the Magic Classroom Space Morphers. And this is... Yes, hi? Come on. Let's cameo. Yes, cameo. I think Astrid wants me to call it a night, too. But yes, the Space Morphers set is extremely cool, even just for the individual bots, and the way they transform is really interesting for most of them. So if you are interested in this kind of thing, I highly recommend trying to get a hold of them. As I said, I got mine from Surtoys, but they are available on AliExpress, and I believe you can probably find them on eBay, though the eBay prices are probably absurd. So I'd say maybe try AliExpress or Surtoys first. If you're into official space stuff and surprisingly cool-looking robots from a company that may not be on par with the high-quality stuff, or when we get high-quality stuff from Hasbro, the high-quality stuff we're used to. Yes, hi honey, you're blocking that. Or the high-quality stuff we're used to from third parties, but it's also not what I would call knockoff quality. I'd put this above that. But anyway, that's that. That's how you can get it, and I think I've spoken enough. So thank you everybody for watching, and remember, art is more than meets the eye.